Hello and welcome back to Health Politics, Policy and Planning. So this is week 3, topic 1, globalisation processes. So you might wonder what globalisation is. It's one of those terms that we often hear talked about and bandied around. But when we start to actually wonder what it is, it's quite difficult to identify. So maybe we'll start by pulling the word apart a little bit. So global, obviously self-explanatory. It means affecting every part of the global planets. And isation, which is added onto the end of that, is a suffix. And that tends to indicate a process. So it means when something is isationalized, it's processified, if you like. It's a result of doing something. Lee, therefore, defines globalization as processes that are changing the nature of human interaction across a wide range of spheres, including socio-cultural, economic, technological, and ecological. And it's important here that we acknowledge the word processes and the nature of human interaction. Because globalization essentially is about how we interact with each other. So how are these processes changing our interactions then? So according to Lee, Buse and Fustukian, there are 3 boundaries of human interaction, and these are spatial, they're temporal, and they're cognitive. And these spatial, temporal, and cognitive boundaries, so spatial meaning as in geographically placed, so if you're spaced apart from someone, that impedes your ability to communicate with them. Temporal means issues around time and our concept of time. And cognitive are the thoughts and value processes and the way we think about things. So what they argue is that these 3 spaces are being eroded by globalization, and we'll go through each one now and discuss why. So let's start with spatial erosion. So as I said, spatial erosion or geographic erosion is due to aterritorial social arrangements which defy geography. So for example, at one time, if you weren't within 50 meters of someone, then you couldn't have a conversation with them. And then along came the telephone, and that allowed some conversations. But as time's gone on, communication technologies have become more and more advanced. So now we have things like social media, we have mobile phone apps that all help us interact wherever we are in whatever place on the planet. But this technology also facilitates foreign exchange and trade, and that's important when we come to look at policy actors later in the next topic. This geographic erosion or spatial erosion has also meant new patterns of human health and disease are emerging, which undermine territorial geographic boundaries of state. So, for example, climate change is not limited to just one country, it affects all countries. It may affect some countries more than others, but essentially if climate change continues as scientists have predicted, then we're all going to feel the effects of climate change with increased temperatures, increased mortality due to infections, possibly food shortages and malnutrition due to drought, for example. So with this spatial erosion, we have really some winners and losers. So with the world being closer together and more connected, neoliberalists argue that trickle-down economics are raising overall standards of living the world over. So, people in poorer or developing countries are able to benefit from this ability to communicate. So I think examples of that might be call centres based in India or so on and so forth. However, Bauman argues that really, though, these trickle-down economics is not happening quickly enough, that there are global elites that are enjoying a disproportionate share of the benefits. And we'll return to this theme in topic 2 as well. So let's now look at temporal erosion. So temporal erosion really is the way in which time is perceived and experienced. So globalization processes have meant, firstly, an acceleration of the pace of time. We're all really busy all the time. And that leads to a feeling of time compression, that time becomes much more and more precious. And this temporal erosion is being manifest culturally in films like In Time, where time itself becomes the currency of that economy, because that's all that matters. You know, people are born with 25, when they reach 25, they have another 25 years to go, and they have to pay for things with time. And over time, you know, and of course, typically people with that are poorer tend to have less time and die sooner. So not a bad analogy with the way things are in our capitalist society, and issues around the social gradient of health, for example. So because of temporal erosions, you know, this compression of time, changes in health determinants are also manifested more rapidly. So, for example, there's an accelerated rate of destruction of the natural environments with climate change and the consequences of survival of climate change. There's also been a relatively rapid rise in non-communicable diseases, which I suppose over the last 50 years have been prevalent perhaps in more developed nations, but developing nations are quickly catching up. They're also now experiencing what we call the double burden of disease, both infectious but also non-communicable diseases such as obesity, diabetes, and CVD. The third boundary of interaction between people is cognitive. So cognitive are how our thoughts, beliefs, ideologies, ethnic and cultural identity are both produced and reproduced. And this idea of being produced and reproduced really taps into sociology. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this. We'll cover it later in the unit. But communication technologies have meant that certain values and beliefs and ideologies have been spread more easily. So they've facilitated what we call cultural hegemony. This means, you know, Western norms and values have been established more globally, and these have been also underpinned by neoliberalism. So things like an emphasis on consumerism, an emphasis on materialism, having stuff, something that we'll talk about in the next in a later topic, and individualism are all features of Western norms and values, and particularly neoliberalism. So the problem with all this is how to ensure health then as a basic human right when health has become a product via attainment and consumption of a regulated marketplace. So let's now look a little bit more about how this erosion of human interaction has had an impact on health. So ideological interests of capital are facilitated by globalisation, and they've taken precedence. So I talked about Western neoliberal values permeating and spreading through communication technologies, but that's also been true of financial and trade markets and the people and the power of the people who invest in those markets. So in a sense, health and health policy has been shaped by these various globalization processes. So for example, in high-income countries, we have less physically active people, but they're consuming much higher levels of fat and sugar. We've had a global decline in the smoking rate, but at the same time, the consequences of people who have smoked in the past are now putting increasing pressure on healthcare systems. Another value underpinned by neoliberalism and Western values is the idea that the elderly are particularly perceived as unproductive. You know, they're retired, don't work, and therefore they become a burden on health resources. So there's been an emphasis on ensuring self-funded retirement and private health insurance. Private health insurance, user fees, contracting out, competitive tendering, public-private partnerships are all neoliberal ideas that have been repeated the world over, and have been enabled and facilitated by communication and globalization processes. And as a result of these things, the determinants of health themselves are becoming more wide-ranging and complex and starting to transcend national borders, which makes it very difficult for governments to deal with these particular health issues on their own. So in summary then, the erosion of spatial, temporal, cognitive dimensions of human interaction have modified the ways humans interact, creating global changes which has implications for health. And what Liebus and Verstookian say is that to combat these particular problems, global health policy is needed. And it's needed to address the ways in which globalization may be impacting health policy, and alternatively, what health policies are needed to respond to the changes raised by globalizing processes. What we need to think about is, what does this mean for policymaking processes and institutions, and which policy actors might have gained or lost as a result of these globalization processes. These are questions that we'll discuss more in the next topic 2. And that concludes the week 3 topic 1, globalization and globalization processes.